Hello and welcome to the .NET Community Stand-Up. My name is John Galloway. I'm a PM on the .NET Community team. And I'm happy to welcome on Jonathan Channon to talk about all the cool things with Carter and .NET 6 and minimal APIs and Carter in general.
Hiya, thanks for having me.
Very exciting. Yeah, this is something where I'm kind of thinking with the .NET ASP.NET Community Stand-Up, we're gonna start inviting more open source projects on and community member speakers on. Trying to do that once a month. So, yeah. So you're the first here. We've done occasional ones, but I think as a kind of series. So this will be cool. As always, I'm going to start with the community links. So let's go ahead and share my screen. There we go. And I will post the community links in the chat. And they're also here. Okay, so let's dig in. So first of all, I wanted to share just as a reminder, some of the sources that I look at, some of the places where I find some of the different community links. There's some really good sources out there. So the Morning Dew has been going on forever. I don't even know how many of these, number 3507. So Alvin is just incredible. There's always a lot of good information in here. So, so this is, yeah. And I just, every now and then, I'll write a blog post on something and I'll see it, pop up, people are sharing it from here. So
makes you feel happy when you see it appear.
Yep. Yeah. This is a new one. And this is Dustin, I believe, and he's doing .NET Catch-Up. Yeah. And so this is cool. This is kind of like an aggregator. It's watching for stuff off of Twitter. This is a real nice way. There's a lot of information floating by on Twitter, but it's kind of hard to keep up with. And so it's great to see those kind of going by. And, just be able to kind of like a heads up display. So. Yeah,
I'm going to drop Dustin in it now and say I think you should get him on here actually to talk about.
Not a bad idea at all. Yeah. One other one that I mentioned last week, but this is Links for Dev, and this is again just kind of an aggregator that pulls in stuff. it's following a lot of different people. This is one actually you had just shared over to me, I believe,
okay, yeah,
in chat. But let's throw this in as well. So this is a great way to kind of keep up with things. And then reorganize them a bit here. This is a Facebook group. I know there's pros and cons to Facebook, but this is really a pretty positive, helpful group. There's a lot of information being shared. One thing that I like about this group is it pulls in people that I don't see, shared in my usual channels. So this will pull in a lot of people from around the world, a lot of great information. So good stuff here as well. And I do see some overlap between them, which is fine. If there's a breakout, post or something, I'll see it shared in a few places.
Yeah.
So I have not read this one. I just saw this shared over.
So this literally came out about an hour ago. So I've skimmed through it, and it's a really good summary of helping people move from MVC to minimal APIs if they so wish. But it's a well researched article.
Very cool. All right. Well, I'm not going to pretend to read it on the fly here, but
it basically covers things like defining routes, how you do security, comparing sort of MVC and minimal APIs, and all the sort of model binding and things like that. So yeah, it's something people should check out.
Cool. This came up from a conversation over the weekend on Twitter. People were saying, how do I find learning material? And so I just wanted to share this, and we're working hard on trying to improve it. On the .NET website, there's this Learn thing up at the top, and you can get to it a few different ways. But if you click on Learn, it'll take you to some of the different things you can do with .NET. And for each of these, it'll take you over to like Microsoft Learn, which is introductory information. We have these 101 videos. So we have a lot of different 101 videos that cover all the different things, C# and Xamarin. And so, and then inside of Microsoft Learn, we've got a lot of content for .NET. We're working hard on this. This is something where, I'm working across several different teams, and we're trying to, identify gaps, and we're watching for which kind of courses people are starting and not finishing, and trying to make things easier to follow.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah, and one that I just worked on actually that went live this last week was this create a web UI. So this is ASP.NET Razor Pages. Just a kind of simple 45-minute, walk through and create a simple application. So and a lot of these are part of different learning paths. So the idea is that, you'll go through and learn several different things in a topic area. So,
have you got one about arguing which JavaScript framework to choose?
Unfortunately not. That's a college level course, and we don't go that far. But that is a good point. There actually is a lot of I'm focused on the .NET stuff, but there is actually a lot of JavaScript specific stuff in here as well too. So there's full courses on Python and Node and all that sort of stuff. Good question in the chat. Are they free? They're all free. Yep. There's no charge or anything for them. You go through and you can get little certifications and whatever. They're just little internet badges, but they're still kind of neat to go through. So yeah, take a look and then let us know. We're really looking for to improve them, make sure that they're useful. So all right, just a few more links here. Damian Bowden continuing his series on improving application security with HTTP headers. So in this one, he's gone through previously in the series looking at Blazor and Razor Pages, and in this one he's looking at ASP.NET Core API. So he's using the security headers package. It's a NuGet package from Andrew Locke. And one of the things he digs into in here is specifically looking at content security policy and how that interacts with OpenAPI. So, it's a nice kind of Fluent API for adding things on. These security policies, when I tried to set them up manually, I I had a lot of trouble, honestly. I didn't know what to set for the headers, and then they wouldn't pass validation and all those sorts of things. So I really like this package because it handles that stuff for me pretty well. Have you had to mess with this stuff much, Jonathan?
A tiny bit. All I'll say is security is hard. So
yeah, exactly. So the two
doing.
things I like is, one, somebody who's been working in this area for a while and been maintaining a library, but also if they get something wrong, people are filing issues and the community is working to improve them. And so that's really nice.
Very cool. Yeah.
Speaking of Andrew Locke, he's continuing a series here on strongly typed IDs. So the problem, and he's done this long running series on this, but the problem here is, if you consider you've got a method like this, get order for user, and we've got an order ID and a user ID, there's no way to know if you're actually passing in the right one. So here he gives the example of switching the order. And, it's a very, and, these are with GUIDs, but you could do the same with integers or whatever. So he has, he's worked with creating like a class, where you can, exactly. Yeah. So
it's
here,
interesting actually, because in minimal APIs, there's something that I'll probably touch on later, is how that binds sort of value types, because by default it will only bind simple types and JSON bodies, but there is a way to get it to bind something like this, which is quite cool.
Yeah, okay, definitely teach me about that when we get to that part. So yeah, so here what he's done is converted this over to using source generators. So source generators work at build time and write code for you. Previously, he was using code generation.roslyn, and so this is actually using source generators to do this, and just talks about the changes in order to do that. This looks really useful to me. I've fought with this personally, like just these IDs, and I hate just having a bunch of IDs everywhere. And so this is kind of a nice setup. So cool. Then just a couple more minimal API related things. So Anthony Giaretti, he's talking about using them with APIs, and specifically in his case, exposing protobuf via REST. So just some code samples on doing that. There's a lot of things where some of this can get pretty verbose. And so it's nice to just kind of like have a nice tight result. And of course, here with gRPC, you can have these generated classes that will kind of set up your, that'll encapsulate your client and service stuff. So one last one here, just sharing. So Damien tweeting about where they're at in the cycle, that they're wrapping up RC1, and there's still time on RC2 in the polish phase, and you can jump in, and then he also links over to here's all the issues, open issues on things that they're still working on, and the prioritization for those.
Yeah, I'd highly recommend looking at Damien's minimal playground repo. It's got
which I'm glad you've called that out. So that's right here. He links to. Yeah, it's
got some pretty cool and pretty scary looking stuff.
Well, and before, as we jump into what you're going to be showing, I think, and we did have some recent shows on this, but minimal APIs is kind of an easier, less low ceremony way of writing like APIs, but then also web applications in .NET 6. And, it handles things like, top level functions and like global usings and things. And we go from really long, repetitive boilerplate code to some pretty lightweight code. Some people see that and say, I don't like this at all. And the good news is you don't have to use it then. It's an option, but it's in the same way that like with Razor Pages and MVC, you can still keep using MVC. It's just a simpler option. However, part of the reason I wanted to have you on is you've been experimenting with this with .NET 6 and Carter. So I wondered if you could kind of, show us like both what Carter is and has done in the past, and then how .NET 6 is impacting
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think a good start is a history lesson, I guess. So I'm not sure if my screen's being shared at the moment.
Okay, so it is. However, it's the screen.
Okay, there we go. Is that?
Yep, that's it.
So, I mean, this is the Nancy website, which was made 11, 12 years ago.
Wow, it's that long.
And so, yeah, and so this is what Nancy looked like way back when, and it kind of gives an example of what it was aiming for. And if you kind of squint a little bit, it looks very much what minimal API is now. So I mean, we could say the ASP.NET team do listen to us. It just takes us 12 years.
It's and I think what's important to think about too, 10, 12 years ago, I mean, people are used to, even with ASP.NET Core, it's already simplified quite a bit. But if you think about that time frame, we still this was early days of MVC on .NET Framework.
Yeah, it certainly was. Yeah, I mean, I think what we're looking at, I mean, MVC came out in around 2007, 2008, something like this. Nancy was 2011, I think. But yeah, I mean, at that time we had Fubu MVC, we had Service Stack, Open Raster, Nancy, Simple Web. Of today we have Open Raster and Service Stack still going. I mean, Carter is the kind of next generation of Nancy, really.
Yeah. I have to jump in. I did warn you about this. We've got 9 people saying, please zoom in. So I think for here, you're really just showing how lightweight the code is, but yeah, there you go.
Yeah, there you go. So yeah, I mean, back then we had a good selection of web frameworks, but as time's gone on, I mean, I think you could take it one or two ways. You could say it's bad that there's no longer many web frameworks around, but actually you could say it's a good thing, because over that period, the ASP.NET team have listened to those that wrote these frameworks and kind of adopted some of the patterns and designs, and now actually it's a good thing, because it's still in the community, because ASP.NET is open source and people can still get involved. Arguably it might be a bit more of a ramp up than a smaller web framework that Nancy was, or Carter, or the others. But it's good that those concepts are now coming in. Before we had Kestrel even, and Nancy was running on its own self-hosted HTTP listener. I mean, I think HTTP listener was a class inside the .NET framework somewhere, but it was simply at the lowest level a socket receiver, essentially. And so Nancy had its own HTTP context called Nancy context, and it was created from the socket layer, and populated the requests and objects and the response objects and things like that. And so whilst it could work with IIS as well, when .NET Core came on the scene, I was lucky enough to work for a company called VQ, who were using Nancy at the time, and they were using Mono and Linux to ship their APIs. But right about that time, we were having issues with seg faults and stuff like that with Mono, and so we kind of thought, well, how much effort will it be to get Nancy to compile on this new .NET Core thing? And so I was right at the coalface, dealing with all the project JSON changes and this kind of fun that we had, which to me doesn't seem that long ago, but it's probably about 7 years ago. And so yeah, that was all good fun. But I mean, VQ actually paid me and paid Andreas, the code junkie, to spend time to get it to work on .NET Core so we could ship on Linux.
Wow.
And after about a year, 18 months, we did do it, and we did ship Nancy on our Linux VMs, which was, great success story. But that kind of paved the way for Carter, because what had happened was when ASP.NET Core came about and Kestrel came about, they had this Owen layer. I don't know if you remember Owen, which, the idea at the time was to allow you to separate your hosts and your application frameworks. And even I remember working with a Node.js server which could translate an Owen request into .NET. So
that was what, open web interfaces for .NET?
That's it, yeah. So it was all good, but then when ASP.NET Core came around, they provided this bridge so you could still kind of talk at a socket or slightly higher level from a socket into the application framework. But what it meant was Kestrel would create the HTTP context, which would then in the Owen middleware would create a Nancy context. Nancy would then take over, do its thing, but then obviously have to return and translate its Nancy context to the HTTP context, so Kestrel could then finalize, essentially. Okay. So that had quite a massive impact on performance, frustratingly. But that's when I kind of thought, oh, well, I wonder if I could kind of take the same concept as Nancy, but put it within the pipeline.
Okay.
And in a couple of hours, I managed to get it working. I was like, oh, this is quite cool. And the performance was, huge. So that's kind of where Carter came from. And as time went on and projects do, I think there was half a dozen of us who were working on Nancy, kind of slowly stopped working on it. And it kind of came to a natural end, really. But that's kind of where Carter came from. But I mean, to give you an idea of downloads, I mean, Nancy, we've got 6.5 million downloads for Nancy over those years. So it was very popular. So yeah, it was a great project to work on. But then came Carter, essentially, which kind of did the same. Kind of find an example. It kind of did the same. It looked very much the same as Nancy did, in that instead of a Nancy module, you had a Carter module. And typically your class, you had dependency injection, and you had, your roots, and you could have two types of delegate syntax. You could have this request and response type thing, or you could just have a HTTP context. And it worked very much like an MVC controller. And actually, what Carter did was it kind of kept Nancy's design and its routing. This routing actually called out to the ASP.NET Core endpoint routing underneath.
Okay.
So we weren't really reinventing routing as such. We were just kind of making it look pretty, shall we say.
Well, I can see two benefits. One is, I mean, definitely as a coding style, it's lightweight. And then also if you've got existing Nancy code, it would seem like this is a way where you can take advantage and get the performance and whatever of .NET Core.
Yeah, I mean, it was fairly straightforward to kind of merge your projects from Nancy to Carter. I know a couple of guys had written their own converter, which basically, I imagine, was just a big find and replace and a few regexes here and there. But you can kind of see extensions here, which weren't on the request object or the context. So that was a way to kind of pull out the ID that you specify in the root, and you can do your thing there. And then we had a content negotiation thing, and it was basically a lot of extensions on the request, the response, and the HTTP context.
Can you talk about content negotiation a little bit? Because that's something where I remember that being a bigger deal a long time ago with like, it's not talked about as much anymore.
It's not, and it's actually something the minimal APIs doesn't currently have. And one of the reasons why Carter is going to continue on .NET 6 for now. I guess I could have a .NET 7 exclusive, and I think content negotiation is going to go into .NET 7. I'm only basing that based on a couple of tweets from David Fowler, back and forth with me. So yeah, there's an exclusive for you. But yeah, essentially what it means is, from an HTTP layer, is you make a request as the client to say, go and get me this actor with number 3 as the ID. We then pull that out of our database as an object, but we then say, instead of returning it as a JSON object or an HTML view, we will negotiate how to return that object. And what this means is it will look at the incoming accept header, and it will say, in that accept header, I will accept JSON as a response, or HTML or XML as a response type. And even if you go finer grained into that, you can actually have, each one can have a weighting. So you can say 0.5 XML, 0.7 JSON, 1.0 HTML. And so the negotiator should take into account those weightings. Based on the higher the number, it will then render that object in response. And so here you might get an XML response, or a JSON response, or an HTML response.
Which is great, because then you don't have to worry about this from the server side, and you don't have to have like different API endpoints for different content types or whatever. You can let your client say, I prefer XML. If you don't have that, give me JSON. Otherwise, whatever.
So what we did with Carter was, and Nancy actually, was we had a thing called a iResponse negotiator, which basically, when you implemented that, it had 2 methods on it, which says, can you handle the request coming in? And then if it could, it would then execute that specific negotiator. So imagine you had 3 response negotiators, XML, JSON, CSV. As a request comes in, it finds those response negotiators and says, for each one of these, can they handle the request based on the accept header? And based on the correct one, it will then render whatever the implementation is to render that type. So we kind of had that. We had the concept of before and after hooks in Carter, and also in Nancy. Today it's probably more like middleware, but in an actual module, you could specifically say, these are the hooks, and this is what I want to happen. We also had some extensions for managing files. So when the request came in, you could just kind of say request.bind this file and save it to a path, or you could just bind it and it will return you the file object. And I'll go into these in a bit about where we are today with them.
So what you're showing right now, this all runs on .NET 5 or?
Exactly, yeah. This is kind of the current state. We've got support for Open API out of the box. You can define your metadata by implementing a root metadata class and give it all sorts of fun things. We had the concepts of model binders, so you can add your own model binder. Again, I'll go into that in a bit, because minimal API doesn't have that concept at the moment, but there are a few tricks which you can do to kind of handle the binding of stuff. Response negotiators I've discussed, and we also had a thing called iStatus code handlers, which, based on the status code, you could then intercept that and return something else potentially. But that's kind of gone away now in .NET 6. But that kind of gives you a good segue to discuss .NET 6 and actually the impact it's had.
Yeah. Before jumping into that, we've had several people ask about how this relates to Blazor. So what I'm picking up from this is, like, the sweet spot for Carter is the HTTP API interactions, and you could call into that from Blazor, but this isn't a front end framework.
No, this is purely server. It's a case of, for me and with Nancy as well, was I didn't like the routing in MVC, and over time the additional overhead that brought with it. And so Nancy and Carter were very explicit in you opt into something. And so I always wanted to see my HTTP method, my route template, and my handler in one part and without attributes. With MVC, you can have a class, like you would here, but you would have a method with potentially various attributes to handle that. And I kind of like this, I don't know what you would call it, but this kind of routing syntax where you define your method and your template and your handler in one go. I mean, obviously this is a delegate, and so it could be a method. You could have a C# method group and just say this get actors ID, get actor by ID, and then you have a method further down which was called get actor by ID, for example.
I mean, if I'm picking up what you're talking about, right? I've heard that referred to as just Sinatra style routing.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So I mean, Sinatra was a Ruby web framework, which had this routing syntax, and then many other languages and frameworks kind of adopted that. And that's kind of where Nancy got its name from. Was Nancy Sinatra was Frank Sinatra's daughter, so Nancy became known as the daughter of Sinatra. And then actually I've got a thing on Carter as well, actually, where I was listening to Jay-Z's Empire State of Mind, and he declared he was the new Sinatra. And so his real name is Sean Carter, so I took Carter out of there. So nice. Kind of nod to Nancy and Sinatra.
Well, I like one thing that you're showing already here is that, like, all these web frameworks learn from and build on each other in some good ways. And, like, I've been happy as an ASP.NET developer that I don't have to jump languages and switch servers and platforms and all that all the time. But I feel like the team has really paid attention to what were some of the good parts, and sometimes faster than others. Sometimes it took a long time to actually see changes, but the ASP.NET team has paid attention to what do people like about Ruby on Rails? What do they like about Node? What do they like about, different sorts of frameworks? And so you can definitely see, and they're pretty honest about, we took a lot of inspiration from, Node package management or middleware or whatever, right? So,
but in one sense, it's a good thing, actually, because I no longer have to maintain a massive library.
Right.
David Fowler has to now do this.
Well, and that's something people don't think about, but you pointed out there's millions of downloads. This has been going for 10, 12 years. People are filing issues. They're upset if their business is hitting a thing, and you've been maintaining this for all that time.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah. But as you say, it's good that, we do now have this minimal hosting, and it does take on board a lot of the concepts from, Nancy and, Sinatra and other frameworks out there. And actually the .NET 6 minimal APIs has had quite an impact on Carter. mainly because a lot of the functionality in Carter is now in minimal hosting APIs.
Well,
And
so that's a good transition, because a few people are saying like, okay, so now what is the what does Carter do? What's the distinction between Carter and what's in minimal APIs?
Sure, yeah. So I mean, I can switch to a demo. I do just want to touch actually on how this impacts current users of Carter, if that's okay, or we
Sure.
can do that after. So as I say, yeah, I mean, it's had quite an impact, and I did actually think about just archiving Carter when .NET 6 came about, because like I say, it did have a lot of the stuff that I wanted to see in a web framework, but there are a few things that I've kept which I think are going to be useful for people. But I will just kind of touch on what's going to change for existing Carter users, which I know they've asked me to share. So if I just show this demo, actually, so there will no longer be a base Carter module and all the functionality that comes with it. So things like if you wanted security, you could type sort of in the constructor here, this dot requires authorization. That is gone. Carter module is now an iCarter module. So there's one method in there where you implement your routes and your delegates. It will no longer have this kind of dependency injection via class constructors, because these classes are now only invoked as the web host starts up and adds the routes to the host, because this is all now doing minimal hosting APIs. It's not using Carter's kind of smoke and mirrors. So it's all that. And so what this means is, for example, this actor provider would end up coming in to this delegate here, which actually I think is a good thing, because it means it's a kind of, I don't want to say pure function, but it's almost a pure function in that the dependencies for your route will be the ones you specifically want. So for example, in this example, you may have various I interfaces which might only be used in 2 routes, but you've got 6 routes defined in your class. So in minimal hosting, you only take the dependency you want for that delegate. And so actually I think that's probably quite a good thing, personally. I've spent the last sort of year in F# and using Giraffe and things like that, and using that functional approach of only kind of taking what you want is, I think, a good thing. Carter also supplied OpenAPI out of the box. That's all gone as well. I would recommend looking at something like Swashbuckle or NSWAG. Again, if you look at Damien Edwards' repo and Fowler's repo, they do an example of how to do that. So the metadata that comes off your routes is no longer in a separate class, and in minimal API hosting, you kind of have extensions here. So you can kind of say this dot or app dot get actors, and then you can have produces and then your type, or produces these status codes and things like that, which you would expect to see in an open API response. There's no model binding in Carter anymore either. What you can do, and which I'll demo in a bit, is in .NET 6, and Damien's got an example here, which I know looks a bit scary, but it's not as bad as it looks. But if you're trying to bind a type, you can basically add a bind async method to your type, and then you have complete control over how that object is model bound. So for example,
so you wouldn't have to write this code. You would rely on this.
You would just create. So for example, if you had a person object that you were trying to bind in your API, if you had a bind async method on that person object with this syntax with these arguments, you then have complete control of how you return your person. So, for example, minimal APIs only bind JSON bodies at the moment. And so, let's say you wanted to bind forms, you could basically have your person object with a name and an age, for example, and you then have this method which you put in your object, and you can then read the form from the request object and create your person object that way, if you so wish.
Got it. Yeah, I think that's going to be a really interesting thing to see over time, because they're definitely trying with minimal APIs to remove the ceremony, focus on the cases that most of the time people are doing. But then the trick with those sorts of changes is you need to make it not impossible to do to change if needed, right?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I'll show an example in a moment, but it's actually I don't mind it for the moment. And again, I think if you want to try and keep your dependencies at the minimum, if there is a case where you do have to have some funky binding, then you just create a method in that object and away you go. There's no massive dependency tree or anything like that. You're in complete control of how that object gets returned from the binder. And lastly, there's no more kind of security concepts in Kata. This will rely on the minimal API extensions. So yeah, Kata's basically gone all in for minimal APIs, and I guess now would be a good time to show you why Kata is continuing the way it is. And actually going back to what you kind of mentioned about these lightweight frameworks, is actually, I would argue they're not lightweight in terms of functionality per se. They look very clean, but actually I think they do have the power to do just as much as kind of MVC does, as long as the extension points are there. And so this was always a fun one that people would say, well, I'll use Nancy for my hobby project. And I would argue why. It's just as powerful. And I think, I don't know whether it's a psychological thing, is where it looks very clean, so therefore it must be very small and it can only handle certain tiny scenarios. But actually, it was just as powerful as anything else out there. And so I would say to people who may have a large MVC project, if you want to look at minimal API hosting and APIs, go for it, because I do think, unless you've got something really odd or something very complex, it will probably do everything you want it to. So yeah, so I mean, this example on screen now is Fowler's example of his to-do code, where you can get a list of to-dos. You can get a to-do based on an ID. You can post and update your to-do objects, and this is all in a program.cs, which might be new to some people. There is no main entry point. There is no namespaces. He does have a using, but there's also the concept of global usings now. And so this looks good for a demo. I think you can kind of show, well, I've got half a dozen routes, and away we go. We've got an API which saves to the database, etc. But going back to that kind of lightweight point, is what happens when you then want a slightly larger API, and maybe you've got an API that deals with customers or products or something like that. If you start adding your routes to this file, and you've got a large API, you're going to have one file with all your routes and 500 lines of code. And so what you could end up doing is actually separating the routes out into something like this, where you could have extension methods, and you could define them like that, and then essentially you could call call those roots hidden behind these extension methods, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where kind of Carter went the next kind of level, in that actually what you can do with Carter is just say, add Carter to your app and map Carter, and it will basically find all of your roots. And so if you've got multiple classes which implement the iCarter module, it will find all these and it will register all those roots. And that way it allows you to kind of separate your roots into certain areas. So this is one example.
So how it finds those roots, it does that based on the interface? Exactly,
yeah. So I mean, as you can see, this actors module implements iCarter module, and what it does is when you add Carter here, what it does is it basically goes through and assembly scans anything with iCarter module or iResponse negotiator, adds it to the service collection, and then when the app is started up, Map Carter under the hood will go and pull out all those iCarter modules, and the endpoint routing will register all the routes in your modules.
Okay.
You can manually wire them up if you wish. You can, as an extension and options in Add Carter, so you can say, well, I don't want you to do assembly scanning. I want you to explicitly register this route and this route. But I kind of figured, rather than saying add customers, add products, add users, etc., if you've got one line which kind of adds all your modules that implement iCarter module, that kind of tidies things up a little bit, should we say.
So for this case, it's scanning through the existing project. Could that be pulled in from like a NuGet package, or could you have multiple projects and you're kind of...
Yeah, you can, as long as it's got a reference to iCarter module, it will find it. So that can be in the same project or in a different DLL or another reference project maybe.
Okay.
So the other thing that wasn't in minimal APIs, which I think was another reason to keep Carter going, was the validation. I know Damien Edwards has talked about, he's got a separate NuGet package which kind of handles validation, but Carter had always had this kind of extension method called validate, but actually it had validate, but it also had bind and validate. But you'll notice here actually in minimal APIs that the binding is now done for you. And so what that will do is it will basically read your body, your JSON body, and basically define and create this actor object. So you have it straight away in your delegate, which is nice. I could delete lots of code from Carter to handle all the model binding. But there was no validation. And so that remains in Carter. What Carter does is takes a dependency on Fluent validation by Jeremy Skinner. And so if you've used Fluent validation before, it simply looks something like this, where you kind of define the rules for your object. In this case, it's an actor object. And here we say the name must not be empty and the age must be greater than 0. And so here we basically say request.validate the actor, and we pass in the object, which we get from minimal API. We can then say, if that's not valid, here we use the new minimal API results class, which has lots of methods on it to handle HTTP return types. So here we return an unprocessable entity, and then we've got this get formatted errors, which is something from Carter, which will basically give you the property name and the error related to it. And so if that's all okay, then we can update our actor in the repository and we can return no content. And so this all uses the minimal API syntax.
So, part of the thing we were talking about earlier is like layering on, like, right, starting with the minimal API and layering on top of that some additional thing. What's your experience been in doing that? Is the API easy enough to work with to be able to layer on that? Or is it kind of like, are you hitting some hard edges where you're having to fight with it a bit?
No, it's not too bad, actually. I mean, things are changing quite rapidly. I mean, I'll show you something in a minute, but I mean, I literally only got that working about, well, not long ago, because it was about an hour ago. I downloaded the latest daily build and managed to get something working, which was good. So I mean, there is that kind of concept that it is still kind of churning away. But in terms of it working with Carter, there's actually very little I had to change. You know, a lot of Carter is based on extensions off existing objects, and so the validate stuff just worked, which was great. I think hopefully in time in .NET 7 validate might be something that comes with .NET 7 rather than kind of taking another dependency on Fluent validation, for example. And so, like I kind of mentioned earlier, if you wanted to do custom binding, you kind of have this bind async method. And I wonder in .NET 7 whether we have like a validate async method as well, which allows you to do custom validation. Maybe that's just a complete kind of guess. But I see no reason why not. So yeah, that's kind of that. I mean, an example of that is, as I say, we've got this kind of custom bind route. And we've got our custom actor object. And you'll see here, what this does is it reads the name and age from the form, which by default minimal API would not do. So I mean, I can hopefully show you that. So I'm not sure if I can zoom in on. Oh, I can. Good. So this is an example of it calling this custom bind route. And the body, oh, I'm going to have to zoom out, I'm afraid. We pass in a form the values there. And then in our minimal API, we then just return what it binds. And so by default, I think that would return a 400. But because we have our custom binder, we create our object based on the form name and age. And in our root, we just simply return this actor. And so this is another feature of minimal APIs, in that this is our return object, and that will just by default do a JSON serialization. As I kind of alluded to earlier, we do have the concept of content negotiation in Carter. So here, for example, this route here where we can get an actor by an ID. If I simply do that, we get Brad Pitt back as JSON. But if I put in my accept header that I want a CSV, then it will return me CSV data. And so if we have a quick look at that, so this is kind of what Carter's response negotiator looks like. And so it has two methods, can handle and handle. And so as the request comes in, we say if the accept media type contains CSV, then that's going to return true, essentially, for this. And so Carter will then call into here to execute this CSV code. And so what we do here is basically say we use a library called CSV helper, which is on NuGet, which is very popular. We basically say if the model is an IEnumerable, then we write the records to that. In our example, it was one actor object. So we create an array because write records needs an array object. And then we basically write to the response this string writer essentially. And so that is one feature that is not in minimal APIs at the moment. I think it will be coming. I think it's going to basically end up in the results class, hopefully. Again, this is just from something David Fowler had said to me on Twitter. But for now, you can use Carter to do content negotiation.
There's a question on that, whether that can be negotiated at a more global level.
No, because I mean, the response negotiator will be there for all of your routes, but the response negotiation will only be executed if you tell it to do that, which is here in your route.
Okay.
So, for example, if we just said return person, that would just return a JSON version of that person, because that's what minimal API is kind of set up to do. But
right.
Here we inject our HTTP response into our delegate, and we then call our negotiate extension, which Carter has got. We pass in the object that we want to content negotiate, basically, and it will either return as JSON or CSV or whatever you write. Whatever, if this could be an XML negotiator, for example. We then got a few other kind of little things, something like this, whereas we can read out multiple values of query strings. So that looks a bit like this. So we can pass in the same query string name or key, give it different values, and then when we execute that, we can then return IDs are 1, 2, and 3, basically by binding that query string key. This is something that minimal API doesn't have, because when you pass in a type here, at the moment it only uses kind of simple types. Apart from things like HTTP request, HTTP context, HTTP response, claims principal, could be some other things. It will basically look for those. Otherwise, it will look for an object in the service collection that you may have registered, or it will try and bind it to a JSON body. You can have a simple type in here, and you can basically tell the framework or to parse it if you have a try parse method. So, for example, I've made a quick comment here, and it goes back to what we were discussing earlier. If you had like a person ID value type, for example, if you had a try parse method, you could control how that was created, and you could put it in as an additional argument here, and it would work. But at the moment, it won't work. It will only do very, very simple types. A little thing that Carter does. We've got a few stream extensions, for example. So say you've got a local MP4 file and you want to return that, then we've got an extension called from stream, which will just let you, it'll basically copy that file stream and return it in the response. We did have some file manipulation and saving those to disk. They have gone away. They might come back for .NET 6, because I had a quick moan at Fowler that iForm file support was not supported. And so actually a guy from the community has sent in a PR, Martin Costello. So we're now waiting for that to get merged. So I'm hoping that will get into the final .NET 6 release. So we may do some stuff with that if it goes in, and if it fits, then we'll put some support back into Carter for that. But yeah, that's essentially what Carter brings to the table. It kind of goes all in on the minimal API syntax. So things like this requires authorization is just an extension off of the root. So if you try to hit that dash secure root, it would then, look up to see if you were authenticated or authorized. My super secure policy is an optional argument. If you have policy-based or role-based security, you can invoke it that way.
That's nice. Okay, so, and that's not something that's near as simple to do.
Yeah, that's not Kata. That's pure minimal API, and also actually this stuff here goes back to the open API support that comes with minimal APIs. So you've got your root, you've got your delegate, but actually you can then give it a name. You can tell it produces this actor object. You can tell it produces that response code, and then what you end up seeing is when you go to your OpenAPI /Swagger UI, you can kind of see that it appears in here. It shows the actor object there. And so previously, like in MVC, you would have an attribute that did that, but this is obviously maybe a bit more explicit. And so, yeah, this all comes for free with minimal APIs.
So what it feels like to me seeing this is that minimal APIs is good, but kind of early, and there are some nice things that are, that are, I wouldn't say missing, but are harder to do at this point. Like you showed organizing things with module, like with the scanning and the validation and content negotiation and
that's it. Yeah, I mean, I think with both Damien and David's examples, is you've got half a dozen roots in a program.cs, but actually once you start building out, you want to probably tidy that up a bit, and so you can do things like this, which is fine. But Kata kind of provides that out of the box for you, and you don't have to kind of think about it.
And what I like with seeing this is that it doesn't say, okay, you got this far with minimal APIs. Now it's a mess and you have to start over, or you need to move to, like instead this kind of layers on. It's like a ramp where I can get some more organization. I can start, adding on some validation, content negotiation, that sort of thing. And then then I could see potentially in the future, like let's say they add in content negotiation. This is something where you could basically just call into that on my code. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah. I mean, my aim is actually to make the ASP.NET team put it into the framework so I don't have to maintain it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think I would say probably for 90% of CRUD APIs that are out there using MVC, you could easily use this. Whether you use Kata or not is another thing. I think you probably should, because it has built-in validation, which minimal API doesn't have. It has content negotiation, which it depends who you speak to, is useful. Some people always return JSON, so it might not be useful. But yeah, I think I'm hoping there's still value in Kata at the moment. Anyway.
Well, there's a lot of positive response. People are liking it in the comments and saying, love it, this is awesome, and that sort of thing. So
good to hear.
So for people that are interested in it and want to follow along, where can they find this? How can they?
So we've got our repo is at github.com/Kata community. We have a samples project, which will have everything in there. We've got a .NET 6 branch with all the latest changes on. So yeah, get stuck. We've got a Slack channel. If you come on over to GitHub, there's a link to our Slack channel. So someone will be there to answer your questions, hopefully. But yeah, it's looking good, and I'm very happy with the minimal APIs, and I'm glad I'm not glad. I'm glad it's there, but I'm not glad it's taken 12 years to get help.
Yeah.
All
Well,
good things come to those who wait.
yeah, thank you for the work that you've put into this over all those years. And then also it's cool to see as you're figuring out like how to integrate with what they're doing, and participating in the repos and giving your feedback, as well as they're building out minimal APIs. It's cool to see that kind of partnership working too.
Yeah, it's good. It's good.
Cool. Well, I shared that link to the repo and to that branch, and I checked out and played with the code yesterday and had some fun looking at it. Pretty, like you're saying, pretty lightweight, and so yeah, cool stuff.
Well, thanks for
All
having
right. Well, I guess we'll wrap up there, and I'll look forward to seeing the continual releases and evolution of this. So
excellent.
awesome. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Cheers.